Today we are going to be looking at a methodology of how to read a sacred text in such a way as to draw strength from it for development of our spiritually co-created personal mythology without the literal, historical, supernatural, or theistic interpretations that the churches prescribe. Before we go any further, I want to reiterate that this spirit of this thing is to bring a mythos back into view to people like myself who could no longer view it, who could no longer find any use in it, who would literally cringe at the sound of people speaking this mythos or referencing this mythos because of the imposed supernatural, literal, historic perspective that is prescribed by the churches. But it is not my intention to disturb anyone's existing paradigm unless they want to. So if you're a traditional Christian believer, please sign off now. Here's an overview of what we're going to be looking at. First, we're going to lay the groundwork for what allegory is and what an allegorical reading is. We're going to look at the source materials for this, which is largely Carl Jung and his text Aeon. And then we're going to look at some pretty cool examples that I've spiritually co-created out of my allegorical reading. This is the difference between a prescribed belief system, which means the churches, you have been raised with and maintain a belief system that was taught to you. You were taught how to interpret reality. You were taught how to interpret the sacred text. There is a great deal of socio-political power engendered in interpretation of text, of reality, of the way we should live. These come with moral codes and ethical prescriptions bound into them. So what we're trying to do today is to transcend that prescription so that we can look at the myth with fresh eyes. Okay, I'm going to do some reading these first couple of slides. I hope you don't mind, but I've done some work selecting these pretty important passages. The first, we're going to look at the idea of allegory, defined by Webster's dictionary as the expression through symbolisms of truths or generalizations about the human experience. Everything that I've selected here is important for some reference, and in this case, I found it amazing that they referenced the human experience, which we see occur later. I found a more detailed definition in the works of Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who was primarily a poet but also did essays, and I found this definition of allegory. We may then safely define allegorical writing as the employment of one set of agents and images with actions and accompaniments correspondent so as to convey, while in disguise, either moral qualities or conceptions of the mind that are not in themselves objects of the senses, or other images, agents, fortunes, and circumstances, so that the difference is everywhere presented to the eye or imagination, while the likeness is suggested to the mind. And this is done connectedly so that the parts combine to form a consistent whole. And I thought it was incredible that Coleridge linked up at the end there the notion of combining the parts to form a consistent whole. This is very Jungian. This is, he may have had some influence from Christian mystic alchemical texts at the time, but I won't. And then I love this quote by Joseph Campbell: "It has always been the prime function of mythology and religion to supply the symbols that carry the human spirit forward." And if we look around us today at the spirit of our times, it is definitely a question of whether or not the human spirit is being carried forward. So we're going to look at from Symbols of Transformation, first by Jung. Standing in contrast to empirical truth, the myth bridges over by analogy. The son is said to have been a hero who died, was born in remarkable manner, and thus attained immortality. The human need responsible for this demand is evidently a desire to transcend reality. This is everyone. This isn't, despite your viewpoint or your socio-political leanings or the paradigm or the culture you grew up in. This is a human desire to transcend reality that Jung is speculating on. And now we'll look at this, and I want everyone to kind of hold in your minds the state of the society and politics and the zeitgeist of America in 2020 when I read this. If metaphysical ideas no longer have such a fascinating effect as before, this is certainly not due to any lack of primitivity in the European, read here, American, psyche, but simply and solely to the fact that erstwhile symbols no longer express what is welling up from the unconscious. This end result is a true antimenon pneuma, a counterfeit spirit, a false spirit of arrogance, hysteria, woolly-mindedness, criminal amorality, doctrinaire fanaticism, purveyor of shoddy spiritual goods, spurious art, philosophical stutterings, and utopian humbug fit only to be fed wholesale to the mass man of today. Wow. So I don't like discussing external realities too much, but it's important here to link up why the mythos that is cut off from our conscious view might still be acting upon us and is being projected outwards. I give the example of conspiracy theory as a secularized form of that kind of projection. If you've ever heard anyone speak to conspiracy theory, you will notice the similarity between the vehemency of one who speaks of conspiracy theory and religious fervor. I postulate it's because the consciousness thinks that it has found an answer. It has found an ordering principle to the chaos of their lives, and it's linked up to something larger than themselves. To conclude here, the spirit of our age, it was a term that Carl Jung used repeatedly throughout his texts. Psychic evolutions do not, as a rule, keep pace with the tempo of intellectual developments. The tempo of and read here, technology, okay, science and technology. The tempo of the development of consciousness through science and technology was too rapid and left the unconscious far behind, thereby forcing it into a defensive position which expresses itself in a universal will to destruction. The political and social isms of our day preach every conceivable ideal, but under this mask, they pursue the goal of lowering the level of our culture by restricting or altogether inhibiting the possibilities of individual development. This problem cannot be solved collectively because the masses are not changed unless the individual changes. And this is a message to reorient yourselves, even if you're educated, reasonable, rational, agnostic or atheist, scientifically minded, empirical, materialist paradigm looking at this, you are not beyond this idea of the mass, the effect of the masses on the individual. And I'll remind you historically that Stalin's communism killed as many people as Hitler's fascism. And once again, I get an uncomfortable feeling when I talk about external reality, but it was necessary for a setup for the next phase. So when moving away from the projections of the unconscious into society, the mass man of today, all those thoughts that we just had a setup on, what is the goal? The goal is, well, one goal is individuation. And individuation is described in one dictionary of Jungian analysis as the process of a person becoming their true selves, whole, indivisible, and distinct from other people or collective psychology. This is realized by assimilating unconscious content into consciousness. Now, it is incredibly important to realize this is a lifelong process. Whether you are a saint, priest, preacher, or the Pope in Rome, as long as you are in human form, you will always have a shadow. You will always have an unconscious. It needs to be continually linked up, like a garden that will overgrow with weeds if not tended to. Individuation is not something you can achieve and then you're done. It is something that is a lifelong process. Jung goes on in Aeon to say the result of self-analysis and synthesis of ego consciousness and the unconscious content is psychic restoration and rejuvenation. Sounds wonderful. Sounds like we could all use a little bit of that. Once again, the we start seeing the repeating themes here of the part becoming a whole that we've referred to earlier. Important point from Jungian body of work, that through the Jungian lens of analysis and transliteration, the unconscious mind speaks in symbols and images, not in words. So, considered from the standpoint of realism, the symbol is not, of course, an external truth, but is psychologically true, for it was and is the bridge that is best, the bridge to all that is best in humanity. That's from Symbols of Transformation. Now, Campbell studied Jung, so you're going to hear some of these same themes, but that links up with that Joseph Campbell quote earlier. Now we're going to jump right in. The Christ, and you'll notice here, I am not referencing Jesus of Nazareth or technically Yeshua, which would be transliterated to Josh in America. The Christ is something completely separate. It is the mythos. Jesus Christ meant Yeshua, the Savior, which was transliterated from ancient Greek into Latin, into English. So the Christ literally means a Savior. It was similar to the Buddha. Okay? The Christ as primary symbol of psychic wholeness, a greater, more comprehensive human, that described whole consisting of the sum of conscious and unconscious processes. This objective whole, the antithesis of the subjective ego psyche, is what I have called the self, and this corresponds exactly to the idea of the anthropos, his term for an archetype of the complete human being linked up from consciousness to unconscious in that spectrum of consciousness. Wherever we find symbols indicative of psychic wholeness, we encounter the naive idea that they stand for God. That might be a seminar presentation all to itself. So we'll just move forward to the last quote here from Aeon. This is exactly what happens in the individuation process, whether it take the form of Christian transformation, except as you become like little children, or a Satori experience of Zen, show me your original face, or a psychological process of development in which the original propensity to wholeness becomes a conscious happening. All right, let's look at the first allegory. Now, you're going to see here that there's two layers, at least two layers of allegory. One is of the readings. The second is of the story structure itself. The allegory is embedded right in the story structure for interpretation. And in this case, Jung references in Aeon the scope of integration, that is psychical integration of the conscious and unconscious, is suggested by the descensus ad infernos, the descent of Christ's soul into hell. The psychological equivalent of this is the integration of the collective unconscious, which forms an essential part of the individuation process. Pretty cool. The next one I found, allegory of the psychological healer from Luke 8:27, where he found a man who was, for our purposes today, mentally ill and healed him. I like here this image. He's touching near the pineal gland, but touching the eye, how this mentally ill man perceives the world. Here's our example of linking up mythos that is acting upon us without our conscious mind. Two people who are talking to each other, who are completely educated, secular, scientific, materialist, rational, reasonable people might use the term, oh yeah, so-and-so is battling their demons. And the other person would know. This isn't reference to a supernatural this, that, or the other. Battling one's demons means struggling emotionally, neurotic pathologies, etc. This battling one's demons, the origin of that expression is this mythos from the New Testament that we have now cut ourselves off from because of the supernatural interpretation imposed by the churches. So I'll read from here, Luke 8:31. And they, the man's inner demons, begged Jesus repeatedly not to order them to go into the abyss, the unconscious. Incredible transliteration there. When they came out to Jesus, they found the man from whom the demons had gone out sitting at his feet, dressed and in his right mind. When Jesus had called the 12 together, he gave them power and authority to drive out all demons and to cure diseases. This is an allegory of the mental healer teaching others to be mental healers. How incredible is that? And if we take this literally, once again, we bump up against issues here with the church's mythology because it's never really addressed that the Christ imbued others with the power to heal. Did they then become divine themselves if they were walking around driving out demons and curing mental diseases? And here from the book Semiotics by Daniel Chandler, we'll link up this idea of using expressions that not only verbally using expressions, but relating to ideas in our mind that are cut off from the mythos. Like metaphors, cultural myths help us to make sense of our experiences. They express and serve to organize shared ways of conceptualizing phenomena within our culture. In the contemporary world, such myths draw upon and are generated by a culture's vocabulary. So I believe we become more rich human beings, more expanded consciousness by becoming self-aware of the mythos that are acting upon us. Here's one of my favorites. This is really cool. Now, here's an example. There is no readings of narrative here, but the allegory is embedded within the story structure itself. And within the Jungian body of work, Jung found that the most common symbol for the unconscious mind was water. This is whether it appears in dreams or mythologies. So the mythos of the Christ walking on water can be transliterated as this person who is a psychic totality can tread the waters of the unconscious without sinking down into them. What a beautiful image. Completing this allegory, we have an example here of someone who is being taught by the teacher of the perfectly individuated consciousness who falls. Come, the Christ said. Peter got down out of the boat and walked on the water and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and beginning to sink, cried out, Lord, save me. So here we have in essence, a guru or a teacher and a student. And the student cries out for help when he begins to experience the fear or desire or duty, those forces of the unconscious that are pulling him down. Now, if you read this literally, once again, the Christian Catholic traditional church mythos has a problem because if Peter walked on water as well, was he divine as well? So the literal, historical, supernatural readings of this doesn't resonate with the modern mind. And if a myth doesn't resonate, if we don't have knowledge of its conscious knowledge of its source and origination, and it doesn't resonate with us, then we are cut off. So here's an incredible comparative religion allegory to the crucifixion of the first in the series of the hanging gods was what Jung, and I think it appeared in Newman texts as well. And this is the hanging of Odin on the world tree, Yggdrasil. So the archetype of the hanging gods is addressed in symbols of transformation. The pine tree of Attis, the hanging of Odin, the whole series of hanging gods all teach us that the hanging of Christ on the cross was nothing unique in religious mythology, but belongs to the same circle of ideas. In this world of images, the cross is the tree of life, the vertical arm. Now, anything that is a symbol within a symbol here, it's an allegory within an allegory. Anything that is vertical is leaving the earth. It is heaven bound. It is celestial bound, sky bound. And at the same time, the tree of death, that which is the horizontal arm of the cross. Intersection of life and time, Campbell called it, the horizontal arm symbolic of a body laying dead across the ground. Just as the myths tell us that human beings were descended from trees, so there were burial customs in which people were buried in hollow trees, and coffins are still used today. Now, a couple of very important points here. First of all, how incredible is it that what he's referring to here is the genetically transmitted knowledge, genetically transmitted symbols in the same way that instincts are genetically transmitted behaviors. And he called these genetically transmitted symbols archetypes. What he's saying here is that we may still have archetypes acting upon us from the evolution of our consciousness, not just our physiology. Our physiology was not the only thing to evolve from the time we were running through the jungle. But there is psychic residue from a time when we were beings that would take shelter in trees to protect ourselves from predators, fall asleep in the trees, and mysteriously, to the primitive consciousness of the unevolved animal, be reborn in the tree each morning. The second very important point here is, when I was younger, in my 20s, I would do this kind of comparative mythology study, but mostly it was just to argue with Christian believers, to undermine their mythos that they were projecting onto me. And if you want to take this information and go and argue with your Christian, Catholic, Orthodox friends on Facebook, you're missing the point of reactivating the symbol. The point here is not to demystify. That's not the point at all. It is a demystification only from the supernatural perspective. The point here is to do the exact opposite. It is to link us back up to something that is larger than ourselves, supra-personal. So the allegories of death and resurrection are pretty cool here too. I'm going to quote from a Campbell interview. This symbolizes the hero God who transcended his earthly existence at the intersection of life and time. And then he held up in the video his hands as a cross. Crucifixion, in fact, from D.T. Suzuki's Mysticism, Christian and Buddhist. The crucifixion is, in fact, has a double sense. One individualistic and the other humanistic. In the first sense, it symbolizes the destruction of the individual ego. This is the allegorical reading. While in the second, it stands for doctrine of vicarious atonement. That's the Christian church's reading. Jung goes on to say in Aeon, this great symbol tells us that the progressive development and differentiation of consciousness leads to an ever more menacing awareness of the inner conflict and involves nothing less than a crucifixion of the ego. Agonizing suspension between two irreconcilable opposites. I'm going to let you, the listener, pause and determine what you think those irreconcilable opposites are. But for conversation, I think what he's hinting at here is the notion that we are part animal, part angel, quote unquote, allegorically. We are both beings of spirit who want inner peace, and we are animals who chase our fears and desires, the genetic directives of consumption and reproduction. And it is quite agonizing on a daily basis. So I would challenge you to try and read. First, you got to find a Bible. Probably, if you were like me before a few years ago, did not have one in the house after 18 years of religious upbringing. But you find a Bible and open up to start with the Gospels of John, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and try reading it and transliterating as you go. And plug in the word cosmos or universe anywhere you see God, the Father, or the Lord. Plug in inner peace or nirvana anytime where you see eternal life. And I'm going to give you an example of how well this syncs up. The term non-duality is pretty popular and not uncommon in people who explore consciousness and students and teachers of consciousness exploration. It means not seeing any difference between you and the consciousness next to you, or the consciousness in the animal, or the consciousness of the tree, the cosmos in general. I am one. I'm synced up. Well, this gives a whole new reading to the idea of John 10:30 when Christ says, I and the Father are one. Now, he was from, obviously, a nomadic desert peoples it was a patriarchal society. So he used that allegory. We think he used the allegory of Father for the cosmos, transliterated from Aramaic to ancient Greek to Latin to English. We think it was Father. But if we take it as I and the Father are one, in the sense of allegorically, he's saying I and the cosmos are one. He's saying there is no barrier between my consciousness and the universe. Well, now this can lead us down the rabbit hole. Now, revisit the idea of the crucifixion myth and think to yourself, here's a consciousness who was beyond fear, beyond desire, beyond fear, because he said, look, I am not my body. You're not crucifying my body. You're not, I and the cosmos are one. Who I really am is my consciousness, and that you can't touch that. And what an incredibly powerful thought for us to take into our daily struggles or so-called battles with our inner demons. Thank you for listening. Hope you got something out of it. Post tenebras, spira lucem.